Okay, so I've used a video to explain the sociological imagination, how that is connected to relationality. And again, we've got this relationship between two things. If we change one, dialectical production. The relationality is the existence of these two things in relationship. Dialectical production is if I change this one, then that necessarily changes this one, and now we have a new form of that relationship where these are both in a different place. I hope this understanding is coming together. It's a very important one. It is sometimes seen as like deeply theoretical, but I think we can all imagine you've been to a birthday party or some sort of like social environment where maybe you don't know people super well, and you're sort of navigating that and trying to figure out like which version of you needs to show up. Who do I need to be in this particular setting? How do I need to speak to other people? Do I need to communicate in a way that is very professional or very intellectual or not those things? We're going to be very different at a work function, for instance, maybe on campus, in an intellectual place, than we would be at work. Especially if that work is more sort of a working class situation, there's a class shift there that we're going to accommodate in terms of even the language, the clothing that we wear, all of these different things. We're going to shift who we are just a little bit to fit what we think the context is, and we could be wrong, but we're going to adapt to what we think we're walking into. And then as we go through that experience, we may also adapt a bit. Again, it's going to be different at a very professional sort of thing, different in a academic setting, different in work potentially, certainly different at happy hour with friends or a birthday party or at a sports event, all sorts of different things. We shift the, the person that we present to the world. It's all part of the same self. Like we're never not ourself, hopefully. Sometimes we might need to be. That's sort of a topic we'll get to later, in terms of double consciousness and how we're reading the world and trying to be safe. But hopefully we get to be ourselves. But even as we're being true to ourselves, we may sort of turn up parts of that self. We might shift a little bit to make our fitting into a certain context easier and more effective. And that's not that we're being untrue to who we are, but we are adapting. We may also adapt on the fly, depending on what somebody says in that context. Or if we figure out, ooh, I read this wrong, we might make some adjustments. I think we've probably all been in those situations. Maybe not all of those situations, but at some point you probably will be. So there's this constant sort of adapting. That is also part of this relational dialectical thing that's happening. MC Escher has, again, some great images to kind of help us think about this. Marx comes in and offers alienation and the concept of estrangement, and he does it in a way that is profoundly human and connected to the way that we feel and experience the world. He is talking specifically about, or kind of using the context of economics, but he is really talking about a human experience. If we limit what we're getting from Marx, then we're really kind of selling it short and we're missing out on how we could apply that to other things. What I want to maybe come back to as I was introducing this whole thing of how you might go into a social setting and adapt. Again, the class thing, if you're going, like, I grew up pretty working class, and there was a huge gap between what I experienced and the person I needed to be on a college campus in college classes, and what my friends and family's life experience was. And a lot of first generation college students will talk about this experience where you're sort of like caught between two places, two worlds, if you will, going back to Berger and world building. But you're caught between these two worlds and neither sort of in either but kind of got a foot in each, in this sort of limbo experience. That starts to help us get a little bit, helps to pull these things together and to connect how maybe Marx's ideas of alienation might connect to other parts of our experience. Let me make that a little bit more concrete. So if we're thinking about just shorthand here, and that gets a little dangerous, but shorthand, if Marx is talking about economics and class, let's say, sociologists tend to talk about race, class, and gender. So we're talking about class. I would argue, and not to be the first or the last probably to do this, but you can take Marx's ideas around alienation and how we separate ourselves in these relationships to larger structures where we're adapting. Think about that in terms of how we dehumanize, which is another word kind of connected to this idea of estrangement. Dehumanize. How we dehumanize ourselves and other people as we enter into these social environments where we need to sort of categorize ourselves. Now, let me make it even more clear. Often in our culture, we talk about our identities. And if we think about, before I go further, a caution with the term identities from a sociological perspective. Identities, most of the way that we think about how people experience the world and pain associated with that, particularly in the United States, because we are an individualist society and we are focused on the experience of the individual, we use a psychological sort of perspective, let's say, where it's very focused on how do you experience the world and how do you make meaning of that within yourself, which is fair. And that's an important piece of the puzzle. And if we want to get beyond that to understand the social structures, and go back to the sociological imagination, the structures that create those experiences and how those things are related, and maybe what we do about, yes, we can do healing and things at the individual level, but how do we create structures that don't produce that experience any longer? Then we have to get beyond the individual. Identity is very much sort of the psychological intrapersonal, sort of making sense of what has happened to me. My identity, gender or race or class, has everything to do how I have experienced structure, which would be sort of US capitalism in terms of class, or maybe it's white supremacy in a US sort of uniquely American formulation, or how we've experienced patriarchy in similar sort of contextual limitations. The structure is not the same thing as my identity. My identity is how I might describe my experience of that structure, but it is inherently profoundly unique to my exact experience. When you start talking about sharing identities, that gets a little bit problematic because, well, your gender or your race or your class, if you're in a different part of the United States, it's going to be a very different experience. To be poor in a city is very different than to be poor on a ranch, or not a ranch maybe because you're poor, but in Wyoming somewhere, or in a rural place. For instance, I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains. Poverty there is going to look very different than in Washington, D.C., where I spent a lot of time and went to college outside of. My point being, identity is an important way to talk about our experience, but in terms of understanding social structures, it's kind of problematic because it is inherently limiting in multiple ways. So that caveat aside, what Marx's idea of estrangement allows us to do, I should say, is to think about how we as human beings, in all of our complexity, are sort of separated from these experiences that other people have and the structures and those kinds of things. So I want to maybe present that idea. I'll let you think about that some more, about how estrangement is not just about sort of the way that Marx presented it in terms of economics, but it's it is throughout our experience. There are these ways in which we are dehumanized, in which we dehumanize others, and some of that is just to make life easier to navigate. If I had to understand the depth of everyone around me's full humanity, I probably couldn't get out of bed in the morning, and that's fair. That's just a lot of information to process, and it's probably not realistic anyway. And yet, we have to be careful about how far down that road we go. I'll leave that there and shift gears just a little bit, because I have talked about Marx in the 19th century. That's the world that he was operating in. Capitalism has changed somewhat fundamentally, and there's a particular way that I want to introduce, or a particular change in the way that it operates, that I want to introduce to you as we continue on thinking about sort of applying this across social structures, hierarchies. We're going to get into talking about gender and race and how all of these kinds of hierarchies and social structures are set up. So I want to build a bridge and let you start thinking about these things. So we talked about Marx, 19th century, moving from farms to factories is kind of the context for this and the way that we can make sense of those ideas. So we're going to hang on to that alienation, estrangement, that whole idea of Leiden, all of that. In the same way that there is a separation between a person and their labor, if we fast forward to the middle of the 20th century, into the late 20th century, into the 21st century, there's this new economic model. It's a variation on capitalism, but it's called neoliberalism. Not often in the United States, but outside of it, has been considerably. It started to be seen in the United States, at least felt, when factories began to move from more expensive parts of the country, so unionized northern factories, think of, in maybe the upper Midwest. Those started to move maybe to the South for a little bit, where it was not unionized. And then fairly quickly, those same industrial processes increasingly left the United States to go to places where labor was cheaper, sometimes dramatically cheaper. There weren't unions. Maybe some of the regulations around safety and other things also helped cut cost. And you can fast forward that into and through the pandemic, where cheap goods were coming from, let's say, China, where you can order something on Amazon, for instance, and they bring it to your house, and it's still cheaper than it could be made down the street. And this is shipping it halfway around the world. Let me back up just a step, because hopefully that feels pretty familiar. Backing up a little bit about the structural pieces about how this was made, there was an agreement formulated, and as agreements like this often are, it was a decision made by those with some power and sort of dictated to those who don't, from Western nations about the mid-20th century. And essentially what they did is they carved up the world and said, okay, there are going to be these places. Sometimes you may have heard of that kind of described as like the global South. But generally speaking, there are these places that are rich in resources. Maybe there's mining for some of those metals that are, the rare earth metals that are in all sorts of fancy electronics these days, for instance. We are going to have these places as sort of extraction zones. So this is where we're going to get the raw materials. And then we're going to send it to this sort of think about it, next tier in the hierarchy. We're going to send it up from the mine to the places where they're going to refine that. And maybe they do that in these kind of bottom of the totem pole places where they extract. Maybe then they refine it. And then they send it off to a place where they take all of these raw materials and then they start to put it together. Maybe they're alloys or something of materials, and they're making more complex, still raw materials, but we're getting to more complex layers. Then maybe those get machined into parts that then are sent somewhere else. And then there's an even more sophisticated layer of assembly and construction of goods into more sophisticated goods. And maybe at this point we're talking about, I don't know, computers, electric cars, who knows. But there's basically raw resources, assembly, and building of goods. And this is where most of those sort of factory jobs that we tend to talk about are. And then at the top, this is sort of where the intellectual work happens. It's where maybe academics live. It's where the engineers are, and they create the plans for these. So if I'm doing it this way, see if I can get this right with the screen. There's the intellectual work that happens, and I create the blueprint for an electric car, say. Here is where all of that gets assembled, from the battery to the actual car to whatever else. It all comes together here, and down here is where the actual resources that make that car possible come from, whether that's metals or whatever else, the rubber for tires, I don't know. But there's this tiering of the world. That's the economics of it and the global politics of it. And you can see all of that sort of play out all the time. And I don't want to turn this into a poli-sci class or make you sit and listen to me ramble on about neoliberalism, because I do think it is fascinating, because that relationality dialectical production function that happens means that when things shifted to that model, there were all sorts of implications down the line, and we're still kind of figuring out what those are in some ways. What is important to think about in terms of our topic here is that when the world is divided in such a way, the employees of each of those businesses in each of those tiers, that also gets divided. And part of the neoliberal philosophical approach was that everyone is essentially like a contractor. The philosophy that then started to come into workplaces was it was less about how do we do this collectively better. There was less loyalty to employers that came right along with that. People were increasingly seen as a cog that can be replaced. Now you need to work for cheaper, because now there's a global economic level of competition. And so increasingly, this is that dialectical production and the relationship piece. Increasingly, people began to feel less like they were competing as a company or as an industry or as a nation. And they began to feel more and more like they were competing as individuals. You can see that in the gig economy very clearly. If I'm calling an Uber, for instance, if I call person A instead of person B, well, that has a very direct economic impact, taking out of the equation how much of that money they actually get. But they're literally competing against each other. Workers in the same office, factory, wherever they are producing value, are now literally competing against each other to do that more effectively for less money. So increasingly we are atomized, which is sort of the fancy academic word for we're isolated, and we become constant economic competitive machines. I feel like this is Marx's worst nightmare, but what we were talking about with alienation and estrangement has now become not just something that happens at work and then you go home and you're no longer part of that, but now we also do it on social media. It has gone from an economic thing to something which was always connected to our full humanity, but maybe you could escape it at times, to now it is part of the air we breathe. I hope that progression and that I jumped over a whole lot there to try to make it more brief, but hopefully some of those key examples can help you sort of track how we've gone from something that might be something that we could sort of isolate as an economic thing to something that now we do when we're just killing time on our phone, competing with other people for likes, or for attention or for the perception of value. At this point, we are so profoundly dehumanized, or at least there's the potential. This neoliberal shift has taken things to an extreme that I don't know that Marx could have really envisioned. I know that sounds maybe like kind of dark or bad, uh, and it doesn't always feel good. I think we all can acknowledge that, and that is going back to Marx. That is part of this human impact felt experience part. That we're talking about people and society, and yet that is inherently connected to the way that we feel and experience the world, our own human value. I want you to continue to think about how, if all of that is true and we are atomized and we are competing in that way, keep thinking about that as we continue on and we start thinking about maybe those ways that you've historically thought about identity, around race, class, gender, how power is created and shaped and moves, and how hierarchies are structured, how social structures operate, and how people move through those. And you might need to back this up. I said a whole lot there, and watch it again. But here's the key part, and why I think the sociological imagination and dialect, all of this stuff is so profoundly important. When you walk into a classroom or your living room or a birthday party, I don't know what it is, any social situation that you walk into, all of this stuff is in the air. You can imagine, I sort of imagine it as like a cloud that you're moving through as you go into a social place. It's affecting you, it's affecting everyone, and collectively you are all shaping it at the same time. And yeah, this starts to get a little bit complex. But all of these things are happening. It's in the air. How do you use these tools to read the room? Understand, well, here's the context. This person just did that. Maybe they just changed the way that they look by taking off a jacket and being less formal. Or maybe they buttoned up a little bit more to make their shirt more formal. It could be any number of different things. It could be people backing away from someone of color. Or this I've experienced just last night. My wife and I were talking to a man who, once we started talking about money, shifted his gaze and pretty much only spoke to me and not her. And she is now a high school teacher, but she was a banker. Like, if you're going to talk about money, you don't want to talk to me. I grew up poor and I want to talk about power, not money. She's the one to talk to. Those kinds of things, the way that power flows in real time, you can start to pick those things out and see how it's working, where the power is moving and who is shaping world building, right? How these things are being constructed in real time. It will give you, why that's valuable. If you need safety in a particular moment, it will give you more tools to understand and read how to be that safe, to be in that safe place that you want. If you are seeing this play out for others, you can help create safety. Maybe it's not even about safety. Maybe it's just about you really want a certain kind of food. I don't know. It runs the gamut. But having these tools and knowing how to read the space is sort of a buzzword, but knowing how to read all of this stuff will help give you advantages in terms of how you're going to respond to it and how you help shape that context. Because again, you can look at the MC Escher picture or think about the relationship between things. If you change the dynamic, the whole thing shifts. And if you know what you're doing, you can do it in strategic ways where you really create some shifts. And that I would offer, especially as we get into talking about race, class, and gender and oppression and hierarchy. If you know how to strategically shape structure by your own actions, then you can really start to create some change that will benefit people. And this is why I do it and care about it. I want to create a world in which there is less pain. And if you understand how the game is played and all of the different factors, yes, it's a lot, but then you can really start to make some meaningful impacts. None of us is going to change the world, not overnight for sure, but the way I think about it is I'd like to leave a really big dent, so somebody knew I was here. Uh, that, I would suggest, is where there's a tremendous amount of hope in all of this. This is learning tools that will help you live the life you would like, and hopefully have some positive impacts as you would also like and take pride in. I will leave it there, but we will continue.